Okay. Can you sit down with me? So you finally got some players together. You've decided to start your own Dungeons & Dragons game, and you're going to be the Dungeon Master. Here's a couple things you should think about before you actually dive in and start getting going with your campaign. Now, when I was young and I started first playing D&D, the Dungeon Master that was sort of the default Dungeon Master in our town played a different version of D&D than I play currently. Basically, it was a make up your character and hope he doesn't die type situation. Back then, you put a lot of effort into making a character, but you knew that there was a certain amount of lethality when playing D&D, and that was sort of the draw to it. Could you survive what the Dungeon Master threw at you and come out the other end with some amazing treasure and new abilities? As I started playing D&D over the years, I started to blend that sort of thought process into what I liked at the time, which was cartoons, movies, comic books, and decidedly so, those influenced me as far as the type of games that I ran. For me, Dungeons & Dragons was never a survival simulation, but it was a chance to portray characters that were larger than life, just like my heroes on TV. So I quickly veered off into what I call the cinematic Dungeons & Dragons campaign. So today we're going to talk about the two different campaigns, actually. The one that I dubbed the realistic survival style campaign, and the other one that I dubbed the cinematic campaign. So let's talk about the survival simulation campaign. Your players are going to make up their characters, and they're going to spend a lot of time investing, well, hopefully they're going to spend a lot of time investing ideas, thoughts, and concepts into this character. They're going to put some time into the character, and they're going to trust you to make sure that you guide them through D&D in a proper manner. The problem is with the survival sort of simulation style campaign is that all cards are off the table. Once the dice hit the table, they can make or break what happens to your character. So, point in case, you're traveling through a dungeon and you happen upon a group of goblins. At that point, it's really just up to fate to decide whether or not you actually come out of that encounter successfully. Obviously, there is a certain amount of player agency that goes into it, making decisions and whatnot. But, if said goblins happen to start rolling natural 20s on you and your characters die, typically that style of campaign means you're rolling up a new character. And dungeon masters who adhere to that concept will embrace it as well, saying, hey, guess what? You died. Time for a new character. While cool, and it does give a very cool edge to the Dungeons & Dragons game that you're playing, that fear of death or that fear of loss. Anybody who's played, a game that, video game that basically doesn't respawn your character, or, in some video games where you lose everything that you had and you have to start over again, permadeath as they call it. They like that style of game. For me, as a player, I put a lot of time into my characters, and to just see them die through a random dice roll is kind of just demotivating and kind of a little bit of a turnoff. So those are the early days of playing D&D for me. The other cool thing about that style of game is that all the loot, all the treasure, everything you get from that style of game takes on a lot more meaning. Mainly because you know that you might not live to see the next fight, or you might not live through the next fight. So a lot of the stuff that you get is more valuable, and it's more near dear to your heart. You don't want to lose it. Now, I've seen the bad side of those campaigns go where you have a character, and I've had friends when we played in these games who had built their character up, and they died. And they had a lot of loot, and it was, at that young age, it was pretty traumatic. There was definitely lots of conversations around the classroom and on lunch break and stuff when we played back in elementary school. People weren't happy, and they would break friendships in some cases. Speaking of friendships in those kind of games, we played with alignments pretty loose and fast, and there were several occasions where players got jealous and said to the DM, look, I want to steal that from so-and-so, or he played a rogue or a thief at the time. I want to kill such and such character. So it leads to a different dynamic in your game for sure, but it definitely gives that sense of realism, and everything is just at a heightened level when you're playing sort of the simulation realistic D&D. So let's talk about the other style, which is really my favorite style of D&D, which is the cinematic style. So, cinematic style basically is born from my love of movies, comic books, cartoons, that kind of media, where the heroes of those stories are the heroes, and the narrative and the stories center around those heroes. Essentially, a cinematic campaign allows you, the dungeon master, to craft some larger than life stories, your own epic Lord of the Rings saga, if you will. It just allows you to really dive in and spin a tale and a story and a narrative like you would find in a movie or a TV series or something like that. So there are some drawbacks to the cinematic series. A couple things I should point out is that, one, if you are going with this kind of a series, the players might start to realize that you are running this type of campaign. And at that point, possibly they might start to realize that they possess a little bit of invulnerability when it comes to some of the threats and such that go on in your game. Currently, I'm running some campaigns in the cinematic style, and it's a very slippery slope to give those characters that sense of, hey, you can die and you can suffer a defeat, but at the same time, not wanting to give away that, sort of plot immunity or plot armor, as we say. I've managed to craft some pretty amazing stories over the past few years with the characters taking the role of those cinematic heroes, and the players love it. It allows them to shine. I give every player a chance in the spotlight, just like a good TV series would or a good movie would. But at the end of the day, you really need to be careful because the excitement will start to erode once the players realize that you're crafting a story versus running a simulation. So here's some tips on running a cinematic campaign that might sort of find a middle ground between a simulation and a cinematic style. So one, your players do put a lot of work into these characters, but advise them early on that you will not kill their characters through a random dice roll. So point number one, that's okay to give that away. And I'm a firm believer in that as a dungeon master, whether you're playing simulation or whether you're playing cinematic style campaigns. A bad die roll shouldn't dictate the fate of your character. I am quick to follow up and tell them that bad decision making can kill your character. So when I refer to bad decision making, I always say to them, well, if I present a challenge for you and there's heavy indication that you will not succeed at that challenge, and maybe that challenge has a different way of approaching it. Pretty standard one is a powerful monster, for example. They encounter a hill giant and they're at level 3, and you just wanted that hill giant to be there for sort of background flavor or what have you, or to drive the plot forward. And some random player in that group, or whoever, decides that they're going to go and fight the hill giant, being level 2 or whatever they are. If they proceed, and you don't want to take that from them, obviously, you don't want to remove player agency to say, hey, you can't do that. But if after all the warnings, they are adamant that they're going to fight this hill giant, you know what? You got to go through with it. You got to show them, like, look, this is the folly of that. This wasn't a bad die roll. This was not, penalizing you. This wasn't trying to punish you. You had every decision to make, and you made the decision to fight the hill giant. So in that case, I always tell them that's fine. The danger of that, of course, is you then create players who are paranoid of tackling any encounter head to head. But just stress to them that as an adventurer in that world, you would weigh your odds of survival. The other challenge that you are going to face as well is how to avoid railroading. So railroading in Dungeons and Dragons is a term that a lot of dungeon masters use when they refer to the fact that players don't have any choice on where they go. Kind of a scripted. Video games use it all the time, on rails, meaning it's going to go from one place to the next regardless of what happens along the way. It's a train analogy. So railroading can be a real problem because if you're crafting a specific narrative in your mind, you see this happening in a certain way. If you're looking at it through the lens of, say, a director, that's sort of how I view my games. I'm the director of my movie. You kind of focus in on exactly how you want it to go. So if you're not careful as a dungeon master, you're not going to leave yourself any breathing room to go left or right if the players decide they want to, change up the script a little bit. It's important that you allow them to do that. And there's nothing wrong with, as a dungeon master, altering your script as you go. For example, if the players decide that they want to go down this side of the tunnel, where your script calls for it to be this side of the tunnel, allow them that choice. Allow them to do that, knowing that you're going to have to think on your feet and alter the script a bit. Okay, this doesn't mean that the players are going to completely change the end outcome of what you thought was going to happen. Think of it more as they're going to change how it happens. So if you have in your mind a epic conclusion to this adventure you're running, a confrontation with a big bad, so to speak, and you had envisioned it going this way, allow the players to maybe feed your creativity and go a different route if they chose. And maybe that's a chance for you to sort of evolve your script and maybe change it up a bit. So think of it like your director's cut version of your script. I mean, this is no different than Dungeons and Dragons modules, which came out in the 80s and now exist today. Modules had a beginning and an end, and they even had specific things that happened, specific beats. But how they arrived at those beats, that was sort of the malleable part of the Dungeons and Dragons module. The DM could sort of shift things around and make things happen differently. So that's no different with your own campaign. So let's get into some tips to really make your campaign cinematic. So cinematic campaigns need heroes. They also need villains. They need lots of good description of the area they're in, but more importantly, they need specific story beats to allow your characters time to shine. D&D can be kind of a drawl, traveling from point A to B, random encounters, weather effects, treasure, loot. It's all pretty mundane stuff by now, and most players are used to pretty much the standard story beats as you go through, and they look for experience. They almost hold their hand out looking for experience points after every encounter. What you need to do is you need to dive deep into your script, and you need to sort of pull out some specific beats that you really want to focus on that's going to really give them that wow factor. So I'll give you an example. On a recent campaign that I ran, I had the players come across a bridge. And for me, the bridge encounter was just a way to get to another location, but I wanted to jazz it up a bit rather than just having them travel across land. I said, let's go through a bridge. And I had something that popped into my mind from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom at the very end of the movie. Indiana Jones is traveling across this bridge and he's flanked on either side by enemies. And the whole sort of intensity and climax of that scene was that the bridge started to fall apart. In fact, Indiana Jones actually cut the bridge so the bridge would fall. And there was this whole sequence of tenseness. What's going to happen if they fall? What's below them? Oh my God, is he going to make it out of the situation okay?
Get moving. Shorty! Chao Chi! Lapsu Tsangza!
Hello, lady, we're going for a ride.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Is he nuts?
He's no nuts. He's crazy.
Molaram! Prepare to meet Kali in hell! Oh! What are you doing? You fool! No!
So I borrowed a little bit from that, and I made this bridge set, and I had the miniatures on it, and it was all done really nicely. But my real sort of wow point came when I decided to collapse the bridge, because I had sort of laid the foundation of it up front by saying this bridge was kind of rickety and whatnot. So taking that moment and making that bridge collapse, I was able to inject some movie magic into the proceedings. Rather than just, hey, you walk across the bridge and you have enemies on one side that are shooting arrows at you, what do you want to do? You can move 5 feet, shoot arrows. I injected a lot more excitement into it. And I took some liberties as well by making them roll dexterity checks and having to make some athletics checks to climb up. Just gave the whole scene kind of a real different feel. Now the question you're probably asking is Dwayne, if they had failed the dexterity, would you have let them fall to their doom? Well, of course not. The fun of it comes in the tenseness of the situation. So if they had failed the dexterity check, maybe I would have fudged the rolls and let them try one more time. The goal of a cinematic campaign is not to, punish the characters, kill the characters, or have the rules dictate what happens in the encounter. It's to give the players that sense of thrill of being in a movie or being the hero in their own movie. That simple twist added a whole new layer of cinematic intensity to the encounter, and the players just loved it. And that's just one of many things that you can do. But the important part is just thinking about how this would look on a big screen and maybe putting a little bit of that into your encounter descriptions. I'll do another example. I have an encounter coming up where they're dealing with a giant, and they're in a collapsed castle. And so one part of me is, hey, that would be a great encounter. They're level 6, 7. It's pretty challenging. They could fight this creature. But my thought is, I can do better. So with this scenario, I'm actually going to have the giant chase them through the collapsing castle, as opposed to just attacking them and rolling initiative. So I'm going to stress to them that this is an encounter you might not want to pursue. Not only that, I've laid the groundwork of the encounter already by indicating in my descriptions that this castle is not structurally sound. There are rumblings in the castle, there's bricks falling, that sort of stuff. So I'm going to push the encounter forward to a get out of here encounter, don't fight it. And the cinematic aspect is, and if you can imagine this in a movie lens, is this giant chasing him through the halls of this collapsing castle, knocking rocks aside as rocks fall on its back, just narrowly avoiding the character, missing the characters as they run, in an attempt to get out of this castle before the giant catches up to them. Sort of a Indiana Jones and the rolling boulder scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, except for the rolling boulder is a giant. So that's the kind of things that you can do to inject some of that into your campaign. Always give your players a chance to shine, and make sure that you're not focusing on one particular character too much, because that's obviously going to, make the other characters kind of feel kind of not cool about it, just like an actor would if they don't get enough screen time. So keep that in mind as you're developing your cinematic campaign. Larger than life, lots of cool descriptions, and take time to look at some places where you can pull out some of those really cinematic moments and make the campaign really shine. So that's my thoughts on 2 different styles of games. If you want to actually find out a little bit more about how to run a cinematic campaign or a survival, realistic-based campaign as well, shoot some comments down below. I can always comment back and let you know sort of how I would tackle specific situations. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I hope you like these videos of the Dungeons & Dragons Academy.